BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. In this episode, I will be discussing Robert Graysmith's book Zodiac from 1986, perhaps the most famous and influential Zodiac book that's ever been written. And first, I would like to give a big shout out to James, who proposed this as an idea for an episode, and I've talked a lot about Robert Graysmith. I've done a book discussion on his follow-up, Zodiac Unmasked, as well as discussing some commentaries on this book, such as The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986, and Robert Graysmith's narrative has been shared in countless different places, even the 2007 Fincher film. But I've never done an individual book discussion on the 1986 Zodiac book until today. And if there are any ideas that you have for future episodes, as you see this is one that was proposed by one of the listeners, you can put them in the comments section down below. For larger things, you can send them to me at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com, and also there are some social media links in the description box. And next week, there will be a return of the Zodiac Killer News Reports, where I'm not necessarily going to be talking about one book during Zodiac Monday, but talking about different subjects. I polled you guys, and I was asking what kind of episodes do you like to hear for Zodiac Monday, and people voted mostly for the Zodiac Killer News Reports. So, always listening to you guys in the comments section and in the chat. And just a couple of very small pieces of Zodiac news. First, I would like to give a big shout out to Ross Geraci over at Planet X Filmworks. Ross just got his 1,000 subscribers, and he released a 1,000 subscriber episode. If you haven't visited Planet X Filmworks, I invite you to do so. Loads of Zodiac Killer content, DB Cooper content, and a bunch of other subjects are discussed on Planet X Filmworks. And also, I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts. You can support this channel at BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNet88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Thank you so much. And River Prawn Pottery. You guys are amazing. Thank you for your regular and consistent support. The next one comes to us from Michael Meyer, who says, "Thank you for all the hard work. Wish I could do more. I'm a poor student, Ned. Hope you're doing great." Absolutely, Michael, and I appreciate any support that you choose to offer. And the last one comes to us from Jeffrey D. Jones, and there is not a message on that one, but Jeff Jones, thank you again for your support as well. With the 1986 book, Robert Graysmith is going to use this as an opportunity to set the stage for Arthur Lee Allen to be the Zodiac Killer. Graysmith is going to take a bunch of different possibilities, and he's going to lay them out for the reader or the listener. I mean, I'm listening to the audiobook on Audible, and he's crafting the narrative to show how Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer. But in the first half of the book, he doesn't quite get there. He's just talking about observations about the Zodiac case. And as you see, this is part one. Part two is going to be coming out on Wednesday to anyone who listens live, and if you're listening to this in the future, feel free to check out part two here on this channel. And as always, please like and subscribe. The first Zodiac crime took place on December 20th of 1968 with the Lake Herman Road murders, and Robert Graysmith gives his analysis of how he believes that crime took place. This saw the deaths of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. And I think that there's a little bit of clarity that has been added from reading/listening to Graysmith's book. For example, one thing that always puzzled me about the Lake Herman Road murders is David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen are sitting in a car at a parking lot on Lake Herman Road. I mean, it's a parking lot, let's just say that. People can call it a turnoff or just a patch of gravel even. But they're in the car that's actually rather close to the road. And the Zodiac's car came in and pulled up on the passenger side of David Faraday's car. And I always thought that that was so weird because it seemed like there should have been enough space for the Zodiac to drive up by the driver's side of the car to completely box in the victims so that they would have to be ordered out. But there are a couple different possibilities as to why this happened. It might have just been easier, it might have been a less tight space, and then the killer could have exited from the driver's side, and then what Graysmith says is the killer walked around to the back windshield and fired a warning shot through David Faraday's back windshield. And I did a recent interview on this channel with Joseph Shores, who more or less asked a question to the audience and to myself, and that was, now, if the Zodiac had a gun or whoever committed the Lake Herman Road murders had a gun, and they've even fired this type of shot, David Faraday would have still been in the driver's seat, and he would have had the ability to put the keys in the ignition and just try to get out of there, floor it, because he's not completely boxed in. As I said, the Zodiac is parked on the passenger side, which would have faced the fence as opposed to the road. And my honest take on the subject is, I think that David Faraday would have just been perhaps paralyzed with fear, completely caught off guard. He was 17 years old. If I had been in that position, and I was sitting in a car with my date or something, I didn't have any dates at all when I was 17 years old, but that's beside the point. If someone had just pulled a gun on me and said, get out of the car, I probably would have done it. I probably wouldn't have jumped into getaway driver mode, keys in the ignition, try to floor it, especially that somebody could have actually been firing gunshots at him. Now, this is very interesting about how Graysmith says that the killer exited the driver's side, walked around to the back windshield, fired the warning shot, then walked around to the driver's side door of David's car and ordered David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen to get out. Then they were shot on the more or less passenger side of the Rambler of the car that David Faraday was in the possession of at the time. And Betty Lou Jensen was actually running toward the road, the hills, so to speak. She was shot multiple times and died instantly. David Faraday was shot one time, execution style, but he actually lived longer than Betty Lou Jensen. As I said, I once did a book discussion on the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986, which is written by Thomas Henry Horan, and I promise that I'm not going to overly dwell on his material in this episode because I want to be talking about Graysmith, but Thomas Horan is perhaps the strongest critic of any type of theory or analysis that Robert Graysmith has shared in any of his Zodiac Killer writings or true crime writings. And this is important because Thomas Horan's material, which is also the subject of the Myth of the Zodiac Killer documentary on Peacock, is that there were multiple people in the killer's car, and there's this car that pulls up next to David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and that somebody exited the driver's side, and then actually they exited the passenger side, which is on the again, it's to the right of David Faraday's car. Somebody exits the passenger side, and that's when the warning shot was fired, and a shell casing is found in that location. I do give him credit for that. And the skeptical explanations of Thomas Horan's Myth of the Zodiac Killer theory are that, well, perhaps it could have bounced off something. The killer fired a gunshot that, and the shell discharged, maybe hit the hood of the second car and then bounced and rolled. There are multiple possibilities, but there is a very strong point in the Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986, and that is that Robert Graysmith describes the killer as being a stocky man. A stocky man exited the car and then began firing the warning shot at David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. There are no witness descriptions of the killer at Lake Herman Road, and it's perhaps inappropriate to make some type of claim like that. I completely agree, and we don't know what the killer looked like. People even think there could have been multiple killers, because prior to the Lake Herman Road murders, there's an individual named William Crow who is driving a car that actually belongs to his girlfriend, but it's a new sports car, and he gets out at the parking lot to tinker with the motor, and a suspicious vehicle pulls in, and then they actually get out and leave. And he said originally there were two people in the car, in the driver's seat and the passenger seat. Then he would change his story later on, saying that it was one person who resembled the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch. However, that just goes to show that there could be people patrolling the area. There could have been two people in the car at Lake Herman Road. There is reason to doubt that, but more or less, I still have to go with one killer and one shooter at Lake Herman Road. I think, though, that out of all of the Zodiac Killer's crimes, the Lake Herman Road murders perhaps has the highest chance of multiple assailants being involved, but as of now I still go with a single killer theory. Then, nothing happens. The Zodiac doesn't do anything. The Zodiac doesn't make a phone call, he doesn't write a letter, he doesn't take credit for the crimes. The entire Zodiac Killer persona was created by this person who wants to brag and taunt, and he gave himself the name Zodiac, but not quite. After the Lake Herman Road murders, everything is just silent for months, and then on July 4th of 1969, perhaps just before midnight, Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau are shot at Blue Rock Springs Park. Now, this is a very different type of shooting because they were not ordered out of the car. They are seeing a suspicious vehicle that pulls up behind them and then leaves. And Mike Mageau, according to Robert Graysmith's narrative, said that it actually looked like a Ford Falcon. And I was talking about this in the past because I had once read a description of how Mike Mageau said that he might have thought that it was a Corvair that had pulled in behind him, and someone was saying, no, he said Ford Falcon. And in Robert Graysmith's 1986 book, it states that it was a Ford Falcon that pulled in behind them, and then the car leaves, and then the car pulls back in. They weren't even 100% sure if it was the same car, and somebody exits the vehicle, and Mike Michaud is telling Darlene Ferrin that he thinks that it's a police officer, and they're trying to get their IDs out, and then a light comes in the window and is more or less blinding them, and then the killer starts firing. Mike Michaud would go on to survive the shooting, but Darlene Ferrin would pass away from her injuries, and she was also not able to give any type of description. Here is one of the most important parts of the book, and that is that Mike Michaud can't see any recognizable facial features. He cannot see any real descriptions of the killer, except saying that he saw his face from a profile. He was a Caucasian male and his face was really big. Other than that, he didn't have much to say. But here's a piece of clarity, and that is that he said that the killer was only about a head taller than the car. And, I mean, I was shocked when I heard that in the audiobook because there are so many different descriptions of the Zodiac killer. Mike Mageau estimated that the killer would have been 5 feet 8 inches tall, maybe around 195 to 200 pounds, beefy but not overly fat. However, a head taller than a car, that really is not very tall at all. That could even be shorter than 5'8". And I know that that's not the most precise thing, and perhaps Graysmith is also taking a few creative liberties, as he does in all of his books, but I mean, that is some cause for doubt, especially for the fact that Graysmith is going to go on and accuse Arthur Lee Allen of being the Zodiac killer. Arthur Lee Allen was 6 feet tall, so, I mean, is he 5 feet 8 inches tall or 6 feet tall? And I do think that that is a little bit of a strike against Arthur Lee Allen, because people who are going to say that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac are just going to be like, Mike Mageau didn't know what he saw. He was completely blinded by the flashlight that the killer was carrying. He was also shot multiple times, and because he is being shot in some very, very painful moments, he's not trying to remember all of the details. But ultimately, Mike Mageau would even go on to say that he saw Arthur Lee Allen in a photo lineup and identified him and said, hey, this is the man who attacked me. It turned out that he is just somewhat of an unreliable witness. But one detail that is included in Robert Graysmith's book is that there was one word that was said from the killer to Darlene, and he just simply called her by her nickname, D. I'm going to be very blunt with you guys. I don't believe that happened. I don't believe the killer said anything. There's even an expansion to the story that he calls her D, and then she says the name Richard. I don't think that happened either. When you listen to different accounts of a story, that's all you can do. Well, now wait a second, this doesn't make sense. Wait a sec, that doesn't make sense. And my honest take on the subject is, I don't think the killer said anything at the Blue Rock Springs shooting. I think that he simply walked over to Mike Mageau and Darlene Ferrin. He was using the flashlight to blind them. He's on the passenger side of the car, and then he's firing the gun at Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau. And I think the whole reason why Mike Mageau survived is simply that he actually, more or less, was able to get into the back seat of the car, so he was able to avoid some non-lethal shots. And the Zodiac did talk about this in a letter, saying that the boy spoiled his aim and then he shot him in the knee, so to speak. I think that's mostly what happened, but it really is a miracle that Mike Mageau was able to survive, being that he was shot so many times. This also begs the question, was that the same killer that was at the Lake Herman Road murders? Because in that case, David Faraday was ordered out of the car and he was shot execution style. If that were the same killer, why wouldn't he have just done it the same way? Maybe it's because the Zodiac wasn't necessarily trying to focus on the murders at all. He just wants to commit these types of crimes so that he can start developing a serial killer persona. After the Blue Rock Springs shooting at 12:38 a.m., Darlene Ferrin was pronounced dead, and at 12:40 a.m., a phone call came in where somebody said that if you go 1 mile east on the Columbus Parkway, there are 2 kids that were shot with a 9mm Luger. I'm the one who did it. I also killed those kids last year. And then the famous taunting line, goodbye. Yes, you guys know all of that. And this becomes the foundation of someone who is not only writing it letters, but also taunting the police and the authorities via phone calls. And recently I've been talking to you a lot about not the letters and not the phone calls, but the cryptograms. On July 31st of 1969, the Zodiac killer would create 3 letters. It's 1 letter that's copied 3 times and mailed to 3 different newspapers. And it also contained 1/3 of a cryptogram in each letter. And this cryptogram would go on to become the 408 cipher. And 136 times 3 is 408. So each cryptogram section has 136 characters. The final line of the solution is just more or less nonsensical. The final 18 characters don't have a specific meaning that has been solved or deciphered as of yet. And I've been talking to you guys a lot about this recently, and I've noticed that there have been many comments coming in saying that they do not believe that the final 18 characters of the 408 cipher have any precise meaning, that it was just added to even out the numbers so that each section has 136, and you wouldn't necessarily know that the one that has the short amount of text would be the final part, because the real trick to solving the 408 cipher is to put the 3 pieces in order, and one of them has to go at the top, one has to go in the middle, and then one has to go at the end. And if you could see that one section of the cipher had less characters, fewer characters, then that would mean that that's the end, and then it's just a matter of time before somebody figures it out. Meaning that the Z18 code, as it's called, is purely filler, and it doesn't have any type of deeper hidden meaning. But Robert Graysmith does explore this possibility in the 1986 book Zodiac, but he also says that it might mean Robert Emmet the hippie. Robert Emmet was an Irish revolutionary who was more or less fearless in the face of death, and there's a statue of him in Golden Gate Park, and it might be referring to the statue, it might be referring to a story, or that solution could be completely wrong. Now, as far as this possibility of the Z18 code being definite filler, I mean, 18 characters. At first, I was completely on board with everyone. I was like, all right, that's it. That's the answer. There's no precise meaning. He just filled it in, so it would be the same number of symbols. There would be 136 symbols in each one of the cryptograms. But then I began to think, why would somebody do that? How hard would it be to just make up a sentence with 18 letters in it? I mean, you could even just add in words that totaled up to 18 letters, even if you didn't want to put them in an exact sentence. He already had the methodology. He already had the system in place. So I'm now just completely back to square one when it comes to the Z18 code, and I could go either way on it, but I do appreciate the skepticism that people are having about it, saying that this is filler, it's not trying to share any type of message. It was meant to confuse the cryptographers. The 408 cipher was ultimately solved by Don and Betty Hardin, a husband and wife team, and they are discussed in this book. And Don and Betty Hardin go on to become Zodiac killer suspects themselves. And I have to say that I absolutely do not think that Don and Betty Hardin were the Zodiac killers, plural, that there's this type of husband and wife team, or even that Don Hardin was the Zodiac, because that would mean that all of these stories about them are false, about how they're just staying up late, working on this cryptogram, trying to get the solution to it, and they're just trying all types of different possibilities, and Betty Hardin is just being relentless. I mean, is this just some massive acting job that was witnessed by their family? Is this just some massive acting job that they put on for everybody to see? The people who think that Don Hardin was the Zodiac would just say, yes, absolutely. They would even point to an episode of America's Most Wanted where he appeared, and then he said, possibly to the effect of, I fool you, by sneaking in that line. The biggest thing is, I fool you. I mean, I don't even think he said that. And people have since brought something to my attention that television shows and interviews are edited, and what most likely happened is he was just cut off because of the editing job, and it just appeared to be somewhat seamless. I don't think that Don Hardin was the Zodiac killer. So now we've gone to the Blue Rock Springs shooting. The next crime that took place was the Zodiac killer's Lake Berryessa stabbing, which happened on September 27th of 1986. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were attacked by the Zodiac killer. He was wearing the hooded costume that had clip-on sunglasses. The Zodiac killer symbol was on the chest of the killer, and it's a black, almost rectangular-shaped hood, and he held them up with a gun, which was most likely a .45. And these are the things that Graysmith talks about a lot in the book. There are different types of guns that are used in the crimes. Firstly, we have the .22 caliber firearm at Lake Herman Road, then the 9mm Luger at Blue Rock Springs. Then there is the .45 caliber firearm that the Zodiac was holding in Lake Berryessa. And this is one where we aren't 100% sure that it was a .45 caliber. Brian Hartnell, the surviving victim from Lake Berryessa, was given photos of different guns, and he recognized it as a .45. I think it was a .45. So the Zodiac is holding them up at gunpoint, saying that he's an escaped convict. He's trying to get to Mexico. He killed a guard while escaping prison in Deer Lodge, Montana. And then he ties them up and stabs them. And he's having an extended conversation with Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard. And Cecilia Shepard just seems absolutely terrified. And also, this is the foundation of a lot of speculation in the Zodiac killer world, because Brian Hartnell will go on to be stabbed 6 times in the back. Cecilia Shepard was stabbed 5 times in the front and 5 times in the back. In Robert Graysmith's 1986 book, it talks about how Cecilia Shepard was stabbed 24 times. It's my understanding that Cecilia was actually stabbed 10 times, but the 24 counts the superficial lacerations that were found on her body. But here's an additional detail. Brian Hartnell is also being interviewed by Robert Graysmith, and he says that when Cecilia was stabbed by the Zodiac, the knife is actually going into her rib cage and breaking the rib bones. Sounds extremely painful. And one of the things that Brian Hartnell recalls is that once they're able to regain just a little bit of composure, they try to stand up, and then they realize their injuries are much more severe than they thought, and Cecilia Shepard was in way more pain than he was, and is just really, really experiencing a lot of turmoil. But here's a point, and this is more or less my original response to Graysmith's assessment of the Lake Berryessa stabbing, and that is that Brian Hartnell's behavior does not seem weird at all. Some people even think that Brian Hartnell was an active participant in this, and that he wanted Cecilia Shepard murdered. That's why she was stabbed more times, and her injuries were more severe. But what Brian Hartnell is saying in these conversations with Robert Graysmith, as are related in the book, is just that he didn't think that he was actually going to get stabbed. He was more or less just thinking that this guy says that he wants to rob them, and he's just going to take their money and try to get to Mexico, or at the very least, he's not actually going to go through with it. And I don't think there's anything weird about Brian Hartnell's behavior, because he's just caught off guard. Some guy in a hooded costume came up with a mask and a gun and a knife, and they just didn't know what exactly was going to happen. And also, it goes to show that this is just another very bizarre thing that the Zodiac has done. And as far as the creation of the Lake Berryessa costume, I've talked about some possibilities in the past that the hooded costume may have existed previously. Well, Robert Graysmith's narrative on it is just sharing some conversations with Brian Hartnell, and he just says the whole time he was looking at the Zodiac, he was just marveling at how intricate and well-designed and well-created this costume was. And, I mean, the famous line is that he said that the Zodiac killer symbol was sewn on with care and precision. So you can interpret that in whatever way you want. Did this person want one of the victims to survive to tell the story of the costume? I don't necessarily think that's what happened. It could be something to the contrary, that he wanted them to die, but he wore the costume because it has some type of significant meaning to him, not to mention that it was at the daytime. It was during the daytime, but it was actually close to sunset, because when Brian Hartnell was looking at the white symbol that was on the Zodiac killer's chest, he said it had an orange glow from the sunlight and the setting sun. Bear in mind that it was September 27th. Again, I don't think there's anything suspicious about Brian Hartnell's behavior, and also, they are able to share some types of physical descriptions, and this is the stuff that Graysmith really gets into at Lake Berryessa. For example, the famous thing is that this killer was estimated to have been 6 feet tall by Cecilia Shepard. They could also see brown hair underneath the killer's sunglasses, because the Zodiac has 2 clip-on sunglasses and a hole for the mouth on the face of the Lake Berryessa costume, and they could see brown hair almost behind the sunglasses. And Brian Hartnell was even someone who he thought that maybe it could have been a wig, so to speak. A lot of people think that the Zodiac killer was wearing a wig at Lake Berryessa because of this description. But also, we have to remember, Mike Mageau saw the Zodiac. and he didn't get a good look at his face. Estimated 5 feet 8 inches tall, big face, Caucasian male, but he did say that he could see things like reddish-brown curls. Now, that's on July 4th of 1969. If we go a couple months into the future to September 27th of 1969, maybe the Zodiac has grown out his hair, or his hair is just a little bit longer in the, well, let's see. That would have been about 2.5 months, let's just say something to that effect, July 4th to September 27th. And some people's hair grows more quickly, some grow slowly. It really depends on the person to person, right? But then you also have the foot impressions at Lake Berryessa that were estimated to have come from somebody who was around 200 to 220 pounds. This is consistent with the physical description that Mike Mageau described of around 200 pounds at Blue Rock Springs. And they even had an officer who was just over 200 pounds walk next to some of the footprints, not exactly next to them, but they're measuring how much of an impact his feet would have had in the soil, and they were noticing that the killer's footprints were actually deeper than the officer who was over 200 pounds. So then they're thinking maybe he's around 220 pounds, and this is how the footprint estimations from the Wingwalker shoes at Lake Berryessa were partially done. There are many different aspects to this. But then, after the Lake Berryessa stabbing, at 7:40 p.m., there was a phone call that came in where somebody once again took credit for the crimes. Now, 7:40 p.m. is very important because at 6:30 p.m., the Zodiac allegedly wrote a message on Brian Hartnell's car door. And Graysmith gives his interpretation of the events. He believed that the Zodiac's car was right next to Brian Hartnell's, or very close by, that this guy is committing the stabbing, and then he's taking off the Lake Berryessa hood, he has the bloody knife, and he puts it on the front seat of the car. And then he goes back and writes the message on the car door saying, "Oh, the stocky man put the bloody knife on the front seat of the car." This will be connected to something that's in the Mullinax report about how Arthur Lee Allen had a story where he had a bloody knife. What was it, 2 bloody knives on the front seat of his car. And it was a story that came from Arthur Lee Allen, and once again, Graysmith is trying to set the stage for his suspect to have been the Zodiac killer, but I'm just not 100% sure that the Zodiac walked back to his car and put the bloody knives on the front seat. I think that is some very intense speculation by Graysmith, and I suppose that he has the opportunity to share his theory, hypotheses, anything that he thinks about the Zodiac case in his own book, but he's stating it as a fact. And here's another issue that is actually discussed in the Zodiac serial killer trilogy by Mark Hewitt, and that is, how did the Zodiac killer know that Brian Hartnell's car door would have been white colored? He has a black felt tip pen, and he writes the message on the car door: the Zodiac symbol, the word Vallejo, the dates of Zodiac activity, and the words by knife. How did he know that it was going to be a light-colored car? I mean, what if it were a black car? How would that have worked? What was shared in Mark Hewitt's books, Hunted, Profiled, and Exposed, is perhaps the Zodiac was just carrying 2 different felt pens, a light-colored felt tip pen and the black felt tip pen that was used to write the message on the car door. And Thomas Henry Warren, again, author of The Great Zodiac Killer Hoax of 1986 and The Myth of the Zodiac Killer, states that he believed that Lake Berryessa was not the same killer as the previous crimes because the Zodiac's letters were written in blue ink and the message on the car door was written in black ink, but when the letters were printed in the paper, they appeared black because black and white, it's the way that they were photographed. So this was a copycat who learned about the crimes from the paper and then practiced his handwriting. You can take that for what you will. I mean, it's an unsolved case. People can share their different types of theories. Now, I think that it's somewhat reasonable to accept that the Zodiac went back to his own vehicle and put the knife and the hood in the car. That's not the craziest theory that I've ever heard, but I do think it's guesswork all the same, because there are numerous other ways that this could have been done. The Zodiac could have stashed it somewhere, like put it on top of a tree branch or something like that, a low-hanging one, and I know I'm just kind of saying something off the top of my head. He could have put it on top of a bush when he knelt down and wrote the message on the card, or look around quickly, no one's around, okay, well, I'm going to write this message. But notice that the Zodiac wrote the word Vallejo, and Graysmith is very keen to point this out by saying that The Zodiac is talking about Vallejo in multiple places. He even says in the August 4th, 1969 letter that he's had good times in Vallejo. He writes the word Vallejo on the car door. And this becomes the foundation of two different theories. One of them is the Zodiac killer lived in Vallejo. He was a Vallejo resident. Graysmith talks about this all the time in the book, about how the person who was driving out of Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs should have had intense familiarity with the back roads. That's a paraphrasing, but that's more or less what Graysmith is saying based on the way that he's driving around these roads. This doesn't seem like somebody who's from a different state and just drove in and committed the crimes and then drove back to another state. This seems like someone who really knew where he was going and making very specific and familiar decisions. Now, the second one is, and this is also in Graysmith's book, that doesn't necessarily mean that the killer was a Vallejo resident. It could have been a commuter, somebody who either worked in Vallejo or had maybe like a second home in Vallejo, something like that. Really what's discussed in the book is that this would be someone who is working in Vallejo and is, again, very familiar with the area, but not necessarily a resident there at the time. And I don't want to jump ahead too much, but so I was just going to say, near the end of the episode, I will talk more about the psychological profile that has been shared in Robert Graysmith's 1986 book, because it's quite different than some of the other psychological profiles out there. But we've seen the Lake Berryessa stabbing, and then there's the phone call that came in. Then on October 11th of 1969, the Zodiac killer commits the murder of Paul Stine, the taxi driver, in Presidio Heights in San Francisco. And then he murders a taxi driver. He more or less gets into the front seat. And this is the stuff that I think Graysmith is also, I mean, maybe he's correct about it, maybe he's not, but he says that the killer was sitting in the back seat, shoots Paul Stine in the right side of the head, then moves to the front seat of the taxi, takes Paul Stine's body, puts it in his lap, and steals the keys, the wallet, and cuts off a piece of Paul Stine's bloody shirt. The event was witnessed by Lindsay and Rebecca Robbins, and the Robbins kids are watching this from a window that is more or less, I forgot exactly how many yards away, but they're watching this from a window. And what Graysmith wants to remind us is, even though it's a substantial distance, it is an unobstructed view. Again, to be very honest, I'm not completely convinced that the Zodiac took Paul Stine's body and put his head in his lap, because there would just be an enormous amount of blood evidence. I mean, that's one thing that they say about the Stine murder, and you can even see some of the photos. It was an extremely bloody crime. Gunshot wound to the head, right? So what could have happened is, what the Zodiac's actually doing is pushing Paul Stine's body toward the floorboards, but it is expected that the Zodiac wore rust-colored pants, and that he was doing that so that they would hide the blood spatter. However, Graysmith does provide an explanation as to how he thinks that this would have taken place, that the Zodiac is taking Paul Stine's body, puts his head in his lap, he's stealing some items from the car, maybe he's trying to make it look like a taxi cab robbery, maybe he's trying to collect trophies, maybe he's trying to cut off a piece of the shirt to mail in with future letters, and it's all done by planning and design. But he also wants to do this to, take the items, and then he takes a parka jacket that he's wearing, and he puts his jacket on, and then the jacket is actually hiding the blood spatter. And they were saying that if people were able to see underneath the parka jacket that was worn by the person, they would see that he actually had a lot more blood on him than they expected. And this is something that Graysmith also points out, where this is one of the biggest blunders in the entire investigation. That is when Graysmith says that the Zodiac is walking away from the taxi cab, and he is witnessed by the officers Eric Selms and Donald Falk, although Donald Falk's name is written as Falks in the book, which again goes to show just exactly how much interaction did Graysmith have with someone who claimed that he saw the Zodiac killer. And one point of criticism that Graysmith has received is for not getting a better story from Donald Falk, and getting a first-hand account from someone who claims that they saw the Zodiac killer, and not only that, but they interacted with him. But Graysmith does believe that Officer Falkenzelms saw the Zodiac killer and spoke to him, and the sole reason why he was able to escape is because an all-points bulletin went out for an NMA, Negro male adult, as opposed to a Caucasian male adult, and they were looking for a black man instead of a white man, and the Zodiac was able to walk by 2 police officers and not get caught. And then what Graysmith says is he thinks that the Zodiac walked into the Presidio, a military installation, and then some events would have happened, and then the Zodiac would have been able to escape. And in the 1986 book, these are some things that people are disputing, even to this day, and it relates to the Zodiac killer's fingerprints, saying in the taxicab, they have bloody fingerprints, and they have latent fingerprints, latent ones that had to be examined by the forensic investigators. And Graysmith is openly saying that he's not even completely convinced that the fingerprints would have come from the killer, because it's a taxi cab, no matter how fresh they are. I mean, there could have been someone in Paul Stein's taxi cab somewhat recently before that, and I would only hope that forensic examiners have some type of way of distinguishing, is this 2 hours old or is it 3 hours old, something to that effect. But Graysmith is expressing doubt that the fingerprints in the taxi cab might even belong to the killer, and he also points out that the Zodiac said that he didn't leave fingerprints behind because he put airplane cement on his fingertips, which is actually model airplane glue. Graysmith even says that through his investigations, that it's actually somewhat of a common tactic that is used by criminals to hide their fingerprints. But here's something else, though, about the Zodiac killer confusing the authorities and the general public. The Zodiac was witnessed after the Stein murder, and he is with his crew cut, and he has the glasses on, the famous Zodiac killer composite sketch, which comes to us from Lindsay and Rebecca Robbins. And then this is completely different than everything that we have seen from the Zodiac killer previously. 5 feet 8 inches tall, beefy, not overly fat, wearing, short, curly brown hair and no glasses. Then at Lake Berryessa, 6 feet tall, dark brown hair, wearing clip-on sunglasses, Presidio heights, 5 feet 8 inches tall, maybe 5 feet 10 inches tall, and wearing glasses, and having short, light-colored hair. And one of the things that I think is the simplest narrative is that the Zodiac was growing out his hair up until October 11th of 1969 and got a crew cut. He was regularly changing his appearance, and that's another thing that helped him avoid the police and the authorities and people looking into him, as well as probably changing all types of styles about him. He is someone who is not going to look the same way all the time, because I don't think the Zodiac was a dumb person. Instead, I think that he was extremely lucky, a little bit of cleverness, and took advantage of some major foibles of law enforcement. But let's get into some of the intense criticisms about Robert Graysmith's book. Number 1, I think the narrative that Graysmith has established about Darlene Ferrin and the Zodiac killer is a big disservice to the Zodiac world, mostly because Darlene Ferrin goes on to become the most famous victim in this case, and I think a lot of the insinuations that she was being stalked by the Zodiac killer are fictitious. I don't think they're accurate, and I think that Graysmith wanted to lead people to believe that Arthur Lee Allen knew Darlene Ferrin personally, and that he was stalking her, that he got into an argument with her on the night that she died. One of Graysmith's biggest pieces of misinformation is that a stocky man driving a white car got into an argument with Darlene Ferrin at around 10:30 p.m. on the night that she died. And this is just absolute, well, it's not absolute fiction. It's what Drew Beeson likes to call graysmithing, taking two ideas that don't belong together and splicing them so they join. And that is that there was a real argument that took place, but it was during the daytime, and Darlene Ferrin wasn't even present. And this just becomes the foundation of Graysmith spreading misinformation. He's trying to make it look like Darlene Ferrin had this type of relationship with the killer, and it becomes the foundation of countless conspiracy theories. I once did an episode talking about why Darlene Ferrin was so involved with all of these conspiracy theories, and so, my take on the subject was that She worked in a restaurant, and it's very easy for people to make the connections. Oh, he was a guest in the restaurant. Oh, he was a regular customer. Oh, he was harassing her in the restaurant. It's very easy to set the stage for that, whereas somebody like Betty Lou Jensen was a high school student. But then we also had someone write in saying that Darlene Ferrin's sister Pam Huckabee would also go on to spread lots of misinformation about the case and accuse multiple different people, just saying that everybody's Zodiac killer theory is right. But then we also have Robert Graysmith trying to present this narrative that not only did Darlene Ferrin get into an argument with a guy at the parking lot, that somebody is stalking her, that somebody is just watching her and observing her. Again, to give my honest take on the subject, I don't think any of that is true. I think that Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau were more or less random targets, and I only say that because it seems like no matter which avenue you investigate, there's just insufficient evidence. So, the next point that I would like to leave you guys with relates to a psychological profile that was created by the Zodiac researchers that is mentioned in the 1986 book Zodiac. And this is some intense stuff. This was my biggest takeaway from the entire thing, and that is that Graysmith is telling the story of how there's this psychological profile out there that this was not an ordinary working man. This wasn't just some guy who was working 9 to 5 and could get away on nights, evenings, weekends, and holidays. No, this was someone who could not hold down regular employment. This was someone who could not have any type of normal working lifestyle because he was too deranged, he was too messed up in the head, he might have been a psychotic to a certain extent, and this is someone who would have been very irregular. Now, this is quite in contradiction to other psychological profiles that have been created about the Zodiac Killer, such as the one that came from Dr. Todd Grande, who said that more or less he thought something to the contrary, that the Zodiac had stable employment, that he was somebody who worked a solitary job. And once again, he is someone who is not necessarily going to be so irregular and disorganized that he can't hold down employment. In fact, he can blend in with society. And Sharon Hagan also created a very similar psychological profile by saying that she thought the Zodiac was someone who, again, was employed, working nights, evenings, weekends. Working on days that are not nights, evenings, weekends, and holidays. So then that's the time when he can go out and commit these crimes. And that just goes to show that the killer is organized. Not someone who is an irregular mess, but someone who actually knows exactly what they're doing and they're able to blend in with society. So I think that Graysmith's profile, partnered with these other contradictory profiles, just gives you a little bit of contrast. And my honest response is that this could be a combination of both. It could be that the Zodiac had regular employment, but maybe it wasn't a 9 to 5 job. Maybe it was something a little bit different. And it's always stayed with me when Dr. Todd Grande said that he thought that the Zodiac was working a solitary job, whereas somebody like Arthur Lee Allen had numerous jobs that were not very solitary, working at a school, so to speak. And also, Arthur Lee Allen was somebody who was very chaotic. This fits perfectly with what Graysmith is saying. Yeah, this guy's too weird to have regular employment. Arthur Lee Allen was chaotic. Not only did he have problems maintaining a job, but also he would just sink into debt and not care, does stuff with like boats and planes and his trailer in Santa Rosa, excuse me. And I think that Graysmith really wants to convince the reader that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer, but I'm not convinced at all. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this discussion. As you see, the early parts of the book are really going to be talking all about the events of the Zodiac activity from 1968 to 69, and in the next part I will share a lot more commentary as opposed to just going through the crimes one by one and doing these very basic walkthroughs. But if you have any comments already, you can put your ideas in the section down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And I release reels every day on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. BlackBoxNed88 over on Instagram. And I will see you guys in part 2 of the discussion. Goodbye.